Pierre Bourdieu, all three woven together. A lecture in 5 chapters. Chapter 5. The field of power, the space of positions, and the map you were never given. Part 1. The problem with every other map, in which we discover that all previous attempts to describe social space were looking at the wrong thing. Every society produces maps of itself. Official maps, statistical maps, political maps, common sense maps. The map that says, there are rich people and poor people, and the difference is money. The map that says, there are educated people and uneducated people, and the difference is credentials. The map that says, there are upper class, middle class, and working class, and you know which one you are. These maps are not useless. They capture something real. But they are all in different ways too simple. They reduce the multi-dimensional space of social positions to a single dimension. Up and down, rich and poor, high and low. And by reducing the space to one dimension, they make invisible some of the most important tensions, conflicts, and dynamics in social life. Marx gave us one dimension, position in the relations of production. Bourgeoisie and proletariat. Those who own the means of production, and those who sell their labor. This dimension is real and important. I have never denied it. But it cannot by itself explain why a university professor and a factory owner, who occupy completely different positions in the cultural field, often find themselves on opposite sides of political conflicts, even when their income is similar. It cannot explain why an artist and a stockbroker, who earn the same amount, experience the world so differently. It cannot explain why the petty bourgeoisie, that vast, complex, heterogeneous middle of the social space, behaves in ways that Marx could never quite account for. Weber gave us a richer picture: class, status, and party. Economic position, social honor, and political power as 3 relatively independent dimensions. Better, more complex, closer to the actual structure of social space. But Weber's framework was descriptive rather than generative. It told us what categories exist. It did not give us a dynamic account of how these categories relate to each other, conflict with each other, reproduce themselves. What I wanted to build was something different. A genuine map of social space, multidimensional, dynamic, capable of explaining not just the positions but the movements. Not just where people are but how they got there and where they are likely to go. And crucially, why the map looks different depending on where you are standing on it. The map I constructed, most fully in distinction but developed throughout my career, has 2 primary dimensions. The volume of capital, how much total capital across all forms a position holds. The composition of capital, what proportion of that capital is economic versus cultural. These 2 dimensions together produce a social space that is considerably more complex and considerably more analytically powerful than the simple hierarchical ladder. Let me explain what I mean. If you have high total capital, a lot of economic capital, and a lot of cultural capital, you are in the dominant class. But within the dominant class, there are 2 quite different positions. Position 1. High economic capital, relatively lower cultural capital. The industrialist, the entrepreneur, the business owner. Rich, powerful in the economic field, less invested in cultural prestige. Position 2. High cultural capital, relatively lower economic capital. The professor, the artist, the intellectual, the senior civil servant. Educated, prestigious in the cultural field, less wealthy than the business owner. These 2 positions within the dominant class are not simply variations on the same thing. They are structurally opposed. And this opposition generates some of the most interesting and most misunderstood conflicts in social and political life. The intellectual who criticizes capitalism. The businessman who distrusts intellectuals. This is not simply a difference of opinion. It is a structural conflict between two fractions of the dominant class who are competing over the definition of legitimate excellence. The intellectual's cultural capital is only valuable if cultural capital is recognized as a genuine form of capital, as a legitimate basis for social prestige and social reward. The businessman's economic capital is only fully legitimate if economic success is recognized as the primary measure of social worth. Each fraction of the dominant class has an interest in the dominance of its own form of capital. And the cultural field, the world of ideas, of art, of criticism, of education, is where the intellectual fraction of the dominant class has structural dominance. This is why intellectuals are often critical of capitalism, not primarily out of solidarity with the working class, but because capitalism, the dominance of economic capital, threatens the relative value of the cultural capital that constitutes their own position. I say this about my own class fraction, and I ask you to hear it not as self-flagellation, but as honest analysis. The intellectual critique of capitalism is real. It has genuine content. It is also structurally interested. Both things are true simultaneously. Good sociology requires being able to hold both. Part 2. The middle ground where anxiety lives, in which we discover that the most sociologically interesting place to be is the middle, and the most uncomfortable. Let me now turn to the middle of the social space. The petty bourgeoisie, the lower middle class, the class fraction that sociologists have always found most difficult to describe and most important to understand. In my analysis, the petty bourgeoisie occupies a specific position in social space. Not dominant, but not dominated either. Middling volumes of capital, with considerable variation in the composition. And this intermediate position generates a very specific habitus. A habitus organized around anxiety, aspiration, and the desperate importance of not being mistaken for the class below. This is the class that distinction is, in some ways, most about. Because it is the class that most actively and most consciously pursues distinction. The dominant class does not need to pursue distinction. It has it. It breathes it. It inhabits it without effort. The dominated class does not pursue distinction. It does not have the capital to do so, and its habitus has not oriented it in that direction. But the petty bourgeoisie, those who are rising, or who fear falling, or who are neither quite one thing nor quite another, these are the people who work hardest at distinction, who study the signals, who follow the cultural trends, who invest in the markers of cultivation, and who, precisely because they are working at it, always reveal that it is work. Let me give you a very specific historical example that I return to in distinction. The rise of photography as a popular art form in France in the 1950s and 1960s. Photography was, at this point, genuinely democratic in access. Cameras were affordable. Film was affordable. The technical skills required were learnable. Anyone could take a photograph. And yet in my surveys, the photographs people took, the subjects they chose, the aesthetic choices they made, were deeply class differentiated. Working-class photography was overwhelmingly social. Family portraits, group photographs at celebrations, the documentation of social occasions. The purpose was to capture and preserve social bonds. The aesthetic criteria were secondary to the social function. Was everyone present? Can you see the faces? Is it a good likeness? These were the questions. Petty bourgeois photography showed a very different pattern. More concern with aesthetic effects. More interest in composition, in lighting, in the photograph as an object of aesthetic interest in itself. More likely to photograph landscapes, architecture objects, not just people. More likely to discuss photography in aesthetic terms, to read photography magazines, to be aware of photographic conventions. And what I find analytically perfect about this is that the petty bourgeois approach to photography was not more successful aesthetically. The photographs were not better by any objective measure. But the approach was more concerned with being seen to take photography seriously, with demonstrating cultural seriousness through the medium of photography. Photography was a vehicle for cultural capital display precisely because it was accessible to everyone, but could be practiced with varying degrees of apparent sophistication. This is petty bourgeois cultural practice in its purest form. The use of accessible cultural forms to perform cultural distinction. Now let me apply this to something contemporary that I find extremely revealing. Social media. Instagram, TikTok, the entire infrastructure of self-presentation that has developed since approximately 2010. If I had wanted to design a sociological laboratory for studying the petty bourgeois habitus in its contemporary form, I could not have done better than Instagram. Instagram is a platform for the continuous performance of distinction. Every photograph is a statement about who you are, what you value, what kind of person you are. The food you eat, the places you visit, the books on your shelf, the art on your wall, the friends you are photographed with, and the specific aesthetics of the Instagram image, the particular quality of light, the careful composition, the specific color palette. These are the contemporary equivalent of the photographic conventions I analyzed in the 1960s. They are the signals of cultural seriousness. The demonstration that you take the self-presentation project seriously. That you have the cultural capital to know what a good Instagram image looks like. But what I find most analytically interesting about Instagram is that it has made the distinction-seeking process completely visible. The desire to be seen as a certain kind of person, to accumulate the symbolic capital of followers, of likes, of recognition, is fully explicit. The machinery of distinction is on the surface rather than hidden. And what this visibility has produced is a class of people I find extremely interesting, the influencer. The person whose entire economic activity consists of converting cultural capital, a particular aesthetic, a particular lifestyle, a particular form of self-presentation, into economic capital through the attention economy. The influencer is the contemporary embodiment of what I called, in distinction, the new petty bourgeoisie. The class fraction, whose entire social position depends on the continuous performance of taste. The professional distinction makers. Part 3, Trajectories, where you came from shapes where you think you're going. In which we discover that social position is not a point, but a vector. One of the things that static descriptions of social position always miss is trajectory. Not just where you are, but where you have come from, and where you expect to go. Because the same objective social position is experienced very differently depending on whether you arrive there from below or from above. In distinction, I distinguish between what I call ascending trajectories and descending trajectories within class fractions. The person who grew up in the working class and has moved into the lower middle class occupies a different position, in their habitus, in their dispositions, in their sense of what is possible and appropriate, from the person who grew up in the upper middle class and has fallen into the lower middle class. Same current address. Very different coordinates in social space when you include trajectory. The upwardly mobile person carries the habitus of their origin. I described something of this in my own case, the boy from the Bayarn at the École Normale Supérieure. You acquire the cultural capital of the new position, but the embodied capital of the original position persists. The working-class boy who becomes a professor still has, in moments of physical relaxation or stress, the bodily hexis of where he came from. The accent that surfaces, the gesture that reveals, the reflex that belongs to a different world. This is what produces what I call the cleft habitus, the divided habitus. The person who belongs fully to neither world, who has the cultural capital of the new position and the embodied traces of the old, who feels in intellectual environments a slight imposture, who feels in working-class environments a slight distance, not at home anywhere fully, but able to see both worlds with a clarity that those who have only inhabited one world cannot achieve. This is perhaps the sociological vocation. Not a comfortable position, but a productive one. The downwardly mobile person is, in some ways, the more interesting case analytically, because they have a habitus formed for a world that no longer corresponds to their current position. They have the dispositions, the expectations, the sense of what is appropriate and possible of a class position that they no longer occupy. This generates a specific kind of resentment, not the resentment of the dominated who have never had, the resentment of those who had and lost, or more precisely, the resentment of those whose expectations exceed their current reality. A historical example that I think is essential for understanding 20th century European politics. The lower middle class in interwar Germany. The petty bourgeoisie, the small shopkeepers, the clerks, the artisans, the minor officials who had built a stable, if modest, social position in the Wilhelmine period. The inflation of 1923 destroyed their savings. The Depression of 1929 threatened their livelihoods. And they faced, simultaneously, the pressure of big capital from above, the large department stores threatening the small shopkeeper, the rationalization of industry threatening the artisan, and the organized working class from below. Their habitus had been formed in conditions that no longer existed. Their expectations of stable respectability, of modest prosperity, of a social position securely above the working class, were no longer being met by their actual conditions. This is the class fraction that provided the social base for National Socialism. Not exclusively. The historical literature on this is complex and contested. But the disproportionate support of the petty bourgeoisie for the Nazi movement is a documented sociological fact. And what I find analytically important about it is this. The Nazi appeal was not primarily economic. It was symbolic. The restoration of social prestige, the elevation of the threatened middle, the identification of enemies, Jews, socialists, cosmopolitans, who could be blamed for the gap between expectations and reality. This is the politics of the cleft habitus in its most destructive form. The habitus that was formed for a world that no longer exists, expressing its resentment through a politics of restored honor. Not a politics of economic interest, a politics of symbolic position. And I say this not as a judgment on the individuals involved. Conditions of extreme crisis do things to human beings that stable conditions do not, but as a structural observation. The politics of symbolic resentment is most powerful among those who have fallen, or who fear falling. Not those at the bottom, who have a different relationship to their position. Those in the middle, who can see both where they came from and where they fear ending up. This analysis is directly relevant to the political landscape of the 2010s and 2020s. The populist movements of the last decade, in France, in Britain, in the United States, in Italy, in Hungary, have drawn disproportionately from precisely the class fractions I am describing. the lower middle class in deindustrialized regions, the skilled working class whose trades have been automated or offshored, people whose habitus was formed in a world of stable employment, of clear social hierarchies, of a social order in which their position was recognized and respected, and who now inhabit a world in which that recognition has been withdrawn. The economic analysis of populism focuses on income decline and economic precarity. These are real and important, but they do not fully explain why so many of the most aggressively populist voters are not the very poorest, who have the most economic grievance, but those somewhat above them. Those for whom the fall is recent, whose expectations were formed in better conditions, whose habitus still carries the dispositions of a social position that no longer exists. The politics of cultural recognition, the demand to be seen, to be respected, to have one's way of life treated as legitimate rather than backward, is a politics of the cleft habitus. Not irrational, structurally produced, and very dangerous when it attaches to political movements that offer symbolic restoration at the cost of material interests. Part 4. The Field of Power, the game behind all other games, in which we ascend to the level where the rules of all the other games are made. I want to introduce a concept that I developed most explicitly in my later work, particularly in The State Nobility and On the State, but which is already implicit in the framework of distinction. The field of power. Every field, the economic field, the cultural field, the academic field, the journalistic field, has its own internal logic, its own forms of capital, its own specific stakes. I described this in Chapter 3 of this lecture series. But there is a meta-level, a field in which the relative value of different forms of capital is itself determined, in which the question of which capital matters most is contested, negotiated, and provisionally settled. This is the field of power. Not a specific institution, not a specific group of people in a room deciding things. A structured space of competition between the dominant fractions of different fields over the definition of legitimate power. The central conflict within the field of power, as I analyze it, is between what I call the dominant fraction and the dominated fraction of the dominant class. Yes, there is domination within the dominant class. I know this sounds paradoxical. Let me be precise. The dominant fraction of the dominant class, those who hold the most economic capital, the great industrial and financial bourgeoisie, those whose power is rooted in ownership of the means of production, in financial instruments, in the economic field. The dominated fraction of the dominant class, those who hold cultural capital, academics, intellectuals, artists, professionals, who are dominant with respect to the rest of society, but dominated within the dominant class by those who have more economic power. These two fractions are in permanent, low-level competition over which form of capital should be the supreme principle of social hierarchy. Should social honor go to wealth, or to culture, to the successful businessman or the distinguished intellectual, to the person who has made money or to the person who has made knowledge? This conflict plays out everywhere. In the arts, where the market value of a work and its critical prestige are often inversely related. In education, where the debate between vocational and academic curricula is, at bottom, a conflict between economic capital and cultural capital over which should be the legitimate purpose of schooling. In politics, where the tension between technocratic expertise and democratic legitimacy reflects the claims of cultural capital and political capital respectively. A specific historical case that I find perfectly illustrative. France in May 1968. I keep returning to May 1968 because it was the moment in my own lifetime when the structure of the field of power became most visible. What happened in May 1968 was not primarily a working-class revolution. The working class participated. The general strike was enormous and real. But the motor of the movement was the cultural fraction of the dominant class, the students of the grandes écoles and the universities, the intellectuals, the artists, the journalists. And what they were demanding, beneath the rhetoric of revolution and liberation, was a specific redistribution within the field of power. They were demanding that cultural capital, education, creativity, critical thought, be recognized as having a different kind of authority from economic power. That the university should not simply serve the economy. That culture should not be subordinated to the market. That the intellectual should have a social role that was not defined by economic utility. These are the demands of the dominated fraction of the dominant class, asserting its autonomy from the dominant fraction. Not a working-class revolution. A revolt of cultural capital against economic capital. Both simultaneously true and limited by this structural position. The working class won the greatest material concessions, the Grenelle agreements that increased wages significantly. The students won the least. The university reforms were largely reversed. And de Gaulle, who understood symbolic power better than almost any other politician of the century, dissolved the assembly and won an election. The field of power reconstituted itself, as it usually does. Now I want to apply the field of power concept to something that has transformed the structure of power in ways that neither I, nor anyone of my generation, fully anticipated. The Internet, and specifically, the relationship between the technology industry and the existing field of power. The emergence of the great technology corporations, Google, Amazon, Facebook, Apple, represents a genuinely novel development in the structure of the field of power. These are entities that hold economic capital on a scale that exceeds most nation-states. Amazon's revenue exceeds the gross domestic product of Portugal. Apple's market capitalization at its peak exceeded the gross domestic product of most European countries. But they also claim a specific kind of cultural capital, the cultural capital of innovation, of disruption, of the future. The Silicon Valley narrative presents these companies not as expressions of accumulated capital, which they are, but as expressions of creative genius, of entrepreneurial vision, of the democratization of information. They claim the symbolic capital of the cultural field, creativity, innovation, the new, while accumulating economic capital on the scale of the industrial field. This is, in terms of my analysis, a genuinely interesting and genuinely dangerous development. The technology corporations have, more effectively than any previous fraction of the dominant class, managed to accumulate both economic capital and cultural capital simultaneously. They are rich, and they are cool. This is unusual. Historically, the very wealthy had difficulty being cool. The aristocracy, the industrial bourgeoisie, they had symbolic capital, but it was the symbolic capital of established authority. The technology billionaire presents himself as a disruptor of established authority, and is believed. This combination, vast economic power plus the cultural capital of the outsider, the innovator, the future, makes the technology fraction of the dominant class extremely difficult to oppose using the normal tools of cultural critique. Cultural critique works by revealing the gap between the symbolic capital a position claims and the actual social interests it serves. But when the cultural claim, we are innovators, we are changing the world, we are democratizing information, contains genuine elements of truth, the critique is harder to make stick. The technology corporation that genuinely changed how people communicate, while simultaneously surveilling them, extracting their data, avoiding taxes, and destroying journalism. This is a more complex object of analysis than the simple industrial capitalist. But the analysis is available if you use the right tools. Part 5. The uses of sociology and the limits of my own position, in which the lecturer attempts, with varying success, to be honest about himself. We have arrived at the end of this lecture series, and I want to do something that I have been building toward throughout, and that I think is necessary if this sociology is to be anything more than a sophisticated intellectual game. I want to turn the analysis on myself. I am Pierre Bourdieu. I hold the chair in sociology at the Collège de France, the most prestigious academic position in France. I hold enormous cultural capital. My books are translated into dozens of languages. My concepts are used by researchers on every continent. I have accumulated symbolic capital, the recognition, the prestige, the authority that puts me among the dominant fraction of the cultural field. And I have used this position to produce a sociology that analyzes how cultural capital works as a form of domination. A sociology that reveals the arbitrary nature of the cultural hierarchy in which I myself occupy a dominant position. This is, at minimum, ironic, and I think it deserves to be addressed directly. The question is not whether my analysis is correct. I believe it is broadly correct. The evidence for it is extensive. The question is whether there is a contradiction between the content of the analysis and the social position from which it is produced. My answer is yes, and the contradiction is not something to be ashamed of or concealed. It is something to be analyzed. Here is the specific tension I want to address. I produce a sociology that questions the value of the cultural capital of the dominant class. I produce it using the most refined instruments of academic sociology, a sociology that itself requires and produces cultural capital of the highest order. My work is difficult. It requires significant cultural preparation to read. The people who read it most carefully are, overwhelmingly, those who already possess significant cultural capital. Academics, graduate students, educated professionals. So my critique of cultural capital is produced for and primarily consumed by the cultural class I am critiquing. Which means that, in one reading, my sociology functions as a form of cultural capital in itself. Reading Bourdieu becomes a marker of intellectual sophistication. Knowing about habitus and field becomes a form of symbolic distinction. The very concepts I use to analyze distinction become instruments of distinction. This is not a comfortable conclusion. It is, however, an honest one. What I want to argue, in response to this tension, is that the contradiction is not fatal, but it requires constant reflexivity. The sociologist who forgets their own position, who produces their critique from an imaginary standpoint of nowhere, as if they were not themselves embedded in a specific social field with specific interests, is producing bad sociology. Sociology that looks critical but is actually complicit. Complicit because it does not acknowledge the conditions of its own production. The reflexive sociologist and reflexivity is not modesty, not self-deprecation, not the performance of humility. The reflexive sociologist constantly asks, what is the social position from which I produce this analysis? What interests does my position generate? What do I see clearly from here, and what do I miss? This is not relativism. It is not the claim that all analyses are equally valid. It is the recognition that all analyses are produced from specific positions, and that the best defense against the distortions of position is to make position visible, not to pretend it does not exist. Let me close this lecture series with a historical observation that I find both depressing and, in a very specific way, encouraging. The The concepts I developed in the 1960s and 1970s, habitus, field, capital, symbolic violence, have been absorbed into mainstream discourse. Not always accurately, not always carefully, but the idea that taste is socially produced, that cultural capital exists and matters, that the school reproduces class while appearing not to, that the body carries social history. These ideas are no longer shocking in the way they were when I first published them. They have become, in some circles, almost commonplace. And here is the tension I want to identify. When ideas become commonplace, two things happen simultaneously. First, good thing. The ideas enter the general stock of analytical tools available to people thinking about society. They become available for use. Second, bad thing. The ideas are domesticated. Their critical edge is blunted. They are incorporated into the existing symbolic order rather than challenging it. The concept of cultural capital has been absorbed into the ideology of meritocracy. Where it originally showed how the school mistakes social inheritance for individual talent, it is now often deployed to argue that if we just give working-class children more cultural capital, the system will work as it promises. The tool of critique becomes the tool of the system it was meant to critique. This is symbolic violence of a particularly sophisticated kind. It absorbs the critique without changing the structure. My concepts have been converted into cultural capital and used to reproduce exactly the distinctions I was trying to reveal. I find this simultaneously maddening and completely predictable. The structure is very good at what it does. I have never claimed otherwise. But let me end with something more than this. Because I do not want to close a lecture series that began with the boy from Denguin arriving in Paris and feeling like an imposter, on a note of pure structural pessimism. What sociology offers is not redemption. It is not a solution. It does not dissolve the structures it analyzes. But it offers something that I have found across a career to be genuinely valuable. It offers the possibility of recognizing the social for what it is. Not natural, not inevitable, not the expression of human nature or God's will, or the efficient outcome of a market. Social, made by human beings, in specific historical conditions, for specific purposes, and therefore, at least in principle, changeable. The habitus is not a prison. It is a probability distribution. The field is not a fate. It is a structured space whose structure can be contested. Capital is not a natural endowment. It is an accumulated advantage that required specific social conditions to produce and requires specific social conditions to maintain. Knowing this does not automatically produce change. History is full of people who understood the structure perfectly and changed nothing. But not knowing it, accepting the social as natural, the arbitrary as inevitable, the historically produced as simply the way things are, makes change impossible. So, we have spent several hours together. You have heard about capital and field and habitus and symbolic violence, and the choice of the necessary, and the dominated aesthetic and the field of power. You may find some of it convincing, some of it irritating, some of it both simultaneously. Good. Irritation that engages is more sociologically productive than comfortable agreement. What I ask, the only thing I ask, is that you take these tools and use them. Not to confirm what you already think. To see what you could not see before. And perhaps if you are lucky or unlucky enough to see yourself. Where you came from. What it made you. And what it might, with sufficient consciousness and sufficient courage, be possible to become.
Pierre Bourdieu, 1930 to 2002. End of the lecture series. Principal works referenced across all 5 chapters. The Inheritors, 1964. Reproduction in Education, 1970. Outline of a Theory of Practice, 1972. Distinction, 1979. The Logic of Practice, 1980. Language and Symbolic Power, 1991. The State Nobility, 1989. On the State, 1989 to 1992. The Rules of Art, 1992. An Invitation to Reflexive Sociology, 1992. The Weight of the World, 1993. Pascalian Meditations, 1997. Masculine Domination, 1998. The Boy from Denguin. At the Collège de France. Still perhaps slightly surprised to be there. Still definitely taking notes.